There's a sound a man makes when his tibia snaps under a controlled joint lock in front of 500 of his peers. It isn't a scream, and not exactly. It's closer to the noise a green branch makes when you bend it past the point of mercy, a wet, dense pop, followed by half a second of pure disbelief, the kind of silence where every man on that parade ground did the same thing simultaneously, looked down at his own legs. I've logged, I guess, 712 operational debriefs in my career. I've written incident reports in the dark with a flashlight between my teeth and somebody's blood drying on my sleeve. I have never, not once, written the words I was required to write that Thursday morning at Fort Bragg. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes sustained a spiral fracture of the right tibia and fibula during a combatives demonstration, administered by Staff Sergeant Nora Vasquez, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd called her Team SEAL. As an insult, in front of everyone, she let him finish the sentence. What happened in the 12 minutes between that sentence and that fracture is the part nobody wants to talk about. The part the sort of battalion commander quietly asked me not to put in the report. The part I'm going to tell you anyway, because Reyes wasn't the only thing that broke that morning, and Vasquez didn't walk away clean, which nobody did. The coffee that morning tasted like hot asphalt filtered through a paper towel, which was fine. Kind of appropriate, even. Fort Bragg in October has a particular flavor. Diesel exhaust, cut grass, something metallic in the air that might be gun oil or might be everybody's ambient stress sweating out through their uniforms. I'd been stationed here long enough that I'd stopped noticing it. That morning I noticed it again. I guess I'm Captain David Okafor. I run the 3rd Battalion's Training Integration Program, which is a title that means I sit in a lot of rooms where people argue about doctrine, and I take notes in a green notebook that I've been using the same brand of since 2009. Like me, college ruled. The Army issues me perfectly functional notebooks. I don't use them. This is my quirk, apparently. Sergeant Major Chun told me once that the green notebooks were a cry for help dressed in organizational behavior. He wasn't wrong. I had a fresh one open on my knee when they brought the companies out onto the parade ground. 512 soldiers, plus give or take, Alpha through Delta, plus the support elements, and 3 companies from the Ranger Battalion embedded for the Joint Combative Certification Block. The kind of formation that makes the ground feel different under your boots, like it's aware of the weight. I was observing, which that was my official function. Observe, assess, document. Plus, the battalion commander, Colonel Hargrove, had decided that the joint certification was going to be the linchpin of his Q4 readiness report, which meant it needed to go well, which meant someone who was good at noticing problems needed to be present, which meant me, sitting on a folding chair at the edge of the demonstration area with bitter coffee and a green notebook, watching 216 Army Rangers try not to look like they were sizing up 296 conventional infantry soldiers as prey. The tension was collegial, professional, the kind of tension that exists between people who respect each other just enough to want to be better than them. Staff Sergeant Nora Vasquez was running the morning combatives demonstration. I'd reviewed her file the night before, because Hargrove had asked me to. She was the designated instructor, and he wanted to know if there were any flags. There weren't. Vasquez had 11 years in, 2 combat deployments, a combatives level 4 certification she'd earned at Fort Jackson, and then apparently supplemented with 3 years of private Brazilian jiu-jitsu training, which she paid for herself on her own time in a gym 40 minutes off post. Her evaluations were consistently excellent. Her last NCO was a man named Pryor who had written in the comments field of her most recent NCOR the single sentence, "The most technically complete soldier I have evaluated in 22 years of service." Pryor wasn't a man who used words carelessly. I'd served with him in Mosul. None of this appeared in my notebook yet. To be fair, I was saving space. She walked out at 0800 with 2 assistant instructors and a man I didn't immediately recognize, big, confident in the way that reads across a parade ground, moving like he owned the grass under him. I wrote 0800/Vasquez plus 3 in my notebook and drew a small line under it. Force of habit. The unrecognized man was Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes. I figured that out about 4 minutes later when the battalion sergeant major leaned over to me and said very quietly, "Reyes is going to be a problem today." Went back to staring straight ahead with the expression of a man who has already filed the relevant paperwork in his head, and is simply waiting for reality to catch up. I wrote Reyes' problem in the notebook. Vasquez ran the first 30 minutes clean, and she was good at this. The demonstration part, the instructional rhythm. She moved, through the fundamentals with the kind of economy that only exists when someone has done a thing so many times. It has become subconscious. Wrist locks, takedown defenses, ground control transitions. She was precise without being mechanical, and she had a way of explaining a technique by letting her training partner highlight the failure before she demonstrated the correction, which meant the soldiers watching understood why before they understood how. That's rare. Most combatives instructors teach the what and assume the why. I wrote 3 pages of notes. The soldiers were paying attention. Plus, the Rangers were paying the kind of attention that looks like not paying attention. Relaxed posture, eyes tracking everything. I recognized it. I'd been in enough rooms with Rangers to know that their version of engaged and their version of bored look exactly the same from the outside, and the only way to tell the difference is by what they do afterward. Reyes was standing near the front of the support element cluster. He had his, arms crossed. He'd been crossing them since Vasquez started. That's not an accusation. A lot of people stand with crossed arms. It's a posture but Reyes had the specific variant of it where the chin is slightly raised and the weight is on the back foot, which I have observed in 14 years of watching people in rooms, almost exclusively in men who have already decided they know more than whoever is speaking. I noted his posture. I don't know why. The notebook has a lot of things in it that didn't seem important when I wrote them. The break came at 0847. I walked to the water station. Reyes walked to the water station. We were the only 2 people there for about 45 seconds, which isn't long enough for anything significant to happen, except that Reyes said, in my opinion, without preamble and to no one in particular, she's textbook. I looked at him. He was looking at Vasquez, who was 20 meters away talking to one of her assistant instructors. She's good, I said. She's textbook, he said again. The second time had a weight, the first one didn't. Academy stuff. Controlled environment. You put her in a real situation against a real threat. She folds. I wrote nothing in my notebook. My hands are full of coffee. You know her? I asked. I know the type. He poured water. Ranger tab doesn't mean what it used to. He walked away. I stood there for a moment with the asphalt coffee and the October metallic air, and I thought, this is going to be in my report. I didn't know yet in what context. Plus, it started again at 0900 with an open demonstration segment. This was the part of the combatives block where the instructor invites qualified volunteers to demonstrate techniques against a resisting partner, with the instructor coaching and correcting in real time. It's designed to show soldiers that the techniques work against genuine resistance, not cooperative training partners. Vasquez called for volunteers, which hands went up. She picked 3 soldiers in sequence. A Ranger private who was clearly trying to impress his NCOs, a conventional infantry corporal who was clearly trying to survive, and a 19D cavalry scout who did surprisingly well and got a genuine round of applause. The 4th hand up was Reyes. Plus, she called on him. He walked to the center of the demonstration area with the same back foot posture and uncrossed his arms and said something to Vasquez that I couldn't hear from 40 meters away. I saw her face. She heard it. She said something back. Short. He laughed. Plus, later, the soldiers closest to that exchange would describe what he said in slightly different versions, the way eyewitnesses always do. But the core of it was consistent across 7 separate accounts I collected for the report. He said, let's see if you can hang. They tell me you're Ranger. Plus, I figured you were Team SEAL. Team SEAL. In 2019, if you weren't current on the specific culture, that one might slide past you. But in that formation, in that company, in that particular constellation of Army Rangers and conventional infantry who had spent the last 3 years watching a specific kind of online discourse filter into actual unit culture, every person within earshot knew exactly what he meant. He meant she didn't belong. He meant Ranger was a brand being diluted. He meant her. 500 soldiers went very, very quiet. I wrote the time in my notebook, 0907. Then I wrote, Reyes, Team SEAL. Then I stopped writing. Vasquez looked at him for what felt like a full rotation of the earth. She didn't blink more than normal. She didn't flush, or if she did, I couldn't see it at 40 meters. She didn't look at her assistant instructors, didn't look at the formation, didn't look at me or the battalion sergeant major or the colonel who had arrived at some point in the last 10 minutes and was standing at the far edge of the demonstration area with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man watching a grenade roll across a floor and calculating trajectory. She looked at Reyes. "Okay," she said. "That's all," in one word. The soldiers closest to her said later that she said it the way you'd say it confirming a coffee order. She set her feet. What followed is the part I've had to reconstruct from multiple angles because I was taking notes and I'm not, professionally speaking, a combatives expert. My notebook from that 12-minute period looks like a seismograph during a moderate earthquake. The handwriting changes character 4 times. Reyes was 6'2", 230-something pounds. He had a legitimate combatives background. Level 3 certified, former collegiate wrestler, 11 years. Of the specific kind of functional aggression that gets built into the body through infantry service. He wasn't a man who didn't know what he was doing. He was also the kind of man who had never had to take something seriously that he'd already decided not to take seriously. That distinction matters. He came at her with the body language of a demonstration, not a fight, the unconscious broadcast that happens when someone believes the outcome is decided. It's not laziness exactly. It's assumption, the assumption that the world will continue to be organized the way it has been organized, which is a thing the body believes even when the mind knows better. Vasquez took his weight, redirected it, and put him on the ground in a time that my notebook records as, and I realized this isn't a standard unit of measurement, faster than I could finish writing his name. He got up. The formation made a sound. Actually, plus, not a cheer. Something lower and less organized, the sound of 500 people updating an expectation simultaneously. He came for what it's worth, again, which she let him establish contact, broke his base, and transitioned to a rear naked choke variation that she held for exactly 4 seconds before releasing and stepping back. I mean clean, plus controlled. The whole thing had the geometry of something practiced 10,000 times. He got up slower. His face had changed. And here is where I need to be precise because what happened next has been described in ways that don't serve accuracy. He didn't lose his temper, not the way people mean when they say that. He didn't swing wild or abandon technique. What he did was subtler and more dangerous. He decided, in the way that certain men decide things, that the problem was effort, that he hadn't been trying, that the corrective was to stop holding back. The assumption underneath the assumption. He came the 3rd time with genuine intent. Vasquez stepped inside his reach, took his arm, rotated her hips, and applied a joint lock that I'm going to describe in the clinical language of the report I eventually filed, a hyperextension technique applied to the right knee joint under dynamic load conditions, resulting in structural failure of the tibia and fibula. The sound. That sound, then the half-second of silence. Then Reyes went down. He did not scream. I want to be clear about that. He made a sound, that branch crack sound I described, and then an exhale, a long controlled exhale, the way trained men do when their body is presenting them with information they haven't processed yet. He went to, in my opinion, one knee, honestly then flat. Vasquez stepped back, which she did not look at the formation. She, TBH, did not look at the colonel, and she looked at her assistant instructor and said, clearly enough that the soldiers in the first 3 rows heard her, "Get the medic." Then, she stood exactly where she was, arms at her sides, and waited. I stopped writing. The green notebook was open in my lap, and I had the pen pressed against the paper hard enough to make an indent without making a mark, and I sat there with the asphalt coffee going cold and the October air doing what it does, and I watched the medics come across the parade ground at a controlled run. I thought about Pryor's NCOER comment. The most technically complete soldier I have evaluated in 22 years of service. I thought about the word complete, and Colonel Hargrove dismissed the formation at 0919. He walked to where I was sitting and stood there for a moment without speaking, which is a thing Hargrove does when he's deciding whether to say the thing he's thinking or the thing he's supposed to say. The indent without a mark, which the empty space with the last 9 minutes should have been recorded. I wrote 0919. Formation dismissed, and Reyes transported. Vasquez, present, standing. I looked up. She was still there. Plus, standing look in the center of the demonstration area while everyone moved around her. Not triumphant, not distressed, Not anything I'd a clean word for. Her hands were at her sides. The grass was kind of still flat where Reyes had gone down. I closed the notebook. The report took me 4 hours to write. Not because the facts were complicated. Because every time, look, I got to the moment. The third engagement, the joint lock, the sound, I would stop and look at the words and feel the inadequacy of them. The way the clinical language was true and also somehow wrong. The way it couldn't hold what actually happened in that 12-minute window on a Fort Bragg parade ground in October with 500 soldiers watching and the metallic air being what it's. I wrote it anyway. I wrote, the pretty much incident occurred as a result of a voluntary demonstration that escalated beyond parameters due to the resistance level applied by SFC Reyes. I wrote, SSG Vasquez applied technique within certification standards. I did not write. He called her Team SEAL, and then he found out what that costs. I did not write. She didn't look at anyone when it was over. Honestly, not one person. Those things went in the green notebook. The Mead one. College ruled. To be fair, the one I keep. The fracture was a spiral. I know this because Sergeant Major Chun told me over the phone at 1,400 that day. And he said it like a man reading a box score, flat, informational, the kind of tone you develop when you've delivered enough bad news that you've learned to hold it at arm's length. Spiral fracture of the tibia and fibula, and Reyes was in surgery at Womack by noon. They'd put in a rod. Plus, I was in my office with a cold cup of asphalt coffee and the green notebook open to a fresh page, and I'd written the word spiral and drawn a small helix next to it, which I do when I'm thinking. The helix looked pretty much like a spring. Actually, spring that had been wound too tight. Chin said, Hargrove wants a full supplemental by 1700. I said, Chun, I filed the primary report at 1330. He said, the primary report is 3 pages. Hargrove wants 7. He wants Vasquez's full training history, the chain of consent for the demonstration, and a timeline of the verbal exchange. He wants me to document what Reyes said. Silence. He wants you to document the circumstances leading to the incident. Chun said carefully. Got it, I said. I hung up. I looked at the helix. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up Vasquez's file and started building the supplemental, and somewhere in the second page I realized that I was building without meaning to a case. Not the case Hargrove had asked for. A different one. The kind of case that doesn't get filed anywhere, that lives in green notebooks, and in the way certain people remember certain mornings. She honestly came to my office at 1530. T requested her. She knocked, stood in the doorway, and said, Sir, do you have a few minutes? Close the door, I said. She sat. Plus, she was still in her PT uniform. Someone had apparently forgotten to tell her she could change, or she decided it didn't matter. She sat the way she'd stood on the parade ground, contained, hands in her lap, not fidgeting. I'd seen soldiers after incidents before, and the wide eyes version, and the blank eyes version, and the version that talks too much to fill the silence. Vasquez was something else. She looked like she was waiting for a bus. Like she'd been waiting for this specific bus for a long time, and had stopped being surprised that it was running late. The I guess supplemental report, she said. You're going to honestly need me to give you the verbal exchange. I have 6 accounts of it already, I said. I don't technically need yours. She looked at me. I'd like yours anyway, I said. She nodded, looked at the wall. Plus, then, pretty much he said Team SEAL. I said okay. He laughed. I set my feet. What did you mean? When you said okay, she thought about it. That surprised me, that she actually thought about it, instead of giving me the version she'd been preparing. I meant that I'd heard it, she said finally, that I didn't need any more information. I wrote that down. Were you angry? I asked. The pause, which I was finished, she said. That's the phrase that ended up in the green notebook with a box around it. Not the report. The supplemental was factual, 7 pages, delivered to Hargrove at 1,658 with 2 minutes to spare. The phrase with the box around it, I was finished. And the reason I boxed is that it was the most specific thing she said in 40 minutes of conversation, which is saying something because Vasquez isn't an imprecise person. She wasn't finished with Reyes. She was finished with a particular version of a particular experience. The version where she absorbs it and adjusts and makes room and moves on, which I suspect she'd been doing in various forms for 11 years. Walk me through the third engagement, I said. Something changed in her face. Subtle, which for what it's worth, the bus stop patience shifted into something more concentrated. He was trying, she said, the third time. In my opinion, not performing. That's when, look, it got real. You escalated. I applied technique against a genuinely resisting partner. That's what the demonstration is for, she said. I looked at her. I mean, Vasquez, I said. You knew. She didn't answer. She looked well at the wall again. Then, the lock I used has a margin. There's a way to apply it that controls the outcome. You can feel the pressure point, you know what's coming before it comes, and you have about 2 seconds to decide how far you take it. And I took it. The room was very quiet. What? I asked pretty much, and because he was going to keep going, she said, because if I put him down clean and got up and let it be a demonstration, he was going to keep. She stopped. Started again. Some men don't stop until there's a cost. That's just true, I guess. And I was done absorbing the cost on his behalf. I wrote, done absorbing the cost on his behalf. Then I put the pen down, and here's the thing about Nora Vasquez that the report doesn't contain, and the supplemental doesn't contain, and that probably won't appear anywhere official until someone decides to write something honest. She was right. Not in my opinion. Legally right. Legally, it was a use of force determination that spent 3 weeks in the JAG's office before coming back as a finding of technique applied within authorized parameters under dynamic resistance conditions. Which is the Army's way of saying, we're not going to court-martial her, and we're not going to clear her, and we're going to let the whole thing live in a gray space where no one has to commit to a position. She was right in the way that takes years to become right. The way that requires a person to absorb a thing repeatedly until they understand its shape. Then make a decision about how much of their life they're willing to spend on it. Reyes was going to keep going. I know this because I've watched men like Reyes keep going in briefing rooms and training fields and deployment cycles the way water finds whatever crack is available. Not because they're evil, because they've never TBH been given a reason to stop. She gave him a reason. The formal review board convened 3 weeks later. I submitted the green notebook as supplemental context. TBH, that's not standard procedure. Hargrove pulled me aside before the board and said, Okafor, a personal journal isn't evidentiary. It's a field observation log, I said. It has a helix drawing in it. I think visually, I said. He stared at me for a long moment. You're going to get yourself sideways on this. Vasquez is a level 4 combatives instructor with 11 years of service and 2 combat deployments, I said. Reyes verbally provoked her in front of 500 soldiers and then applied genuine force in a voluntary demonstration context. The notebook documents the operational circumstances. The notebook documents your feelings, David. Some of them, I said, yes. He didn't submit the notebook. I guess I didn't push it. That's not the battle I was equipped to fight, and I'm honest enough to know where my reach ends. The board took 4 hours. Reyes got a letter of reprimand in his file. A cold thing, a paper thing, the kind of record that might matter for promotion and might not, depending on who's reviewing and what they think they're seeing. He was out of surgery and on crutches, and apparently he'd told his platoon sergeant that Vasquez got lucky with a freak accident, which his platoon sergeant had apparently responded to with the kind of silence that functions as disagreement. Vasquez received a formal counseling statement for failure to modulate force in a non-operational context. I read that sentence 4 times when the board findings came across my desk. Failure to modulate force. I looked at that for a while. Then I wrote it in the green notebook and drew a small line under it. And then I wrote under the line, she modulated. 11 years of modulating. Until she didn't. The part that comes after the part is always quieter and more complicated than the part itself. Vasquez didn't appeal the counseling. I expected her to. She had grounds. She had documentation. She had 6 eyewitness accounts of the verbal provocation and a JAG finding that cleared her technique. She had Pryor's NCOER comment. She had me, and whatever that was worth, which wasn't nothing. She didn't appeal. I called her. Why? I said. Because an appeal is a fight, she said. I'm choosing my fights. This one's worth fighting. Maybe, but it's not the one I want on my record. The counseling statement says failure to modulate. You know what that also says? She didn't wait for me to answer. It says I mean the force to modulate. That I was the one with something to modulate. That's not nothing, sir. I sat with that. That's a long way to look at a counseling statement. I said, I've been in 11 years, she said. I look at everything from a long way. 3 days after the board, I ran into her in the parking lot outside the gym. 0530 dark still, the Fort Bragg morning doing its thing with the cold, and the diesel smell, and the distant sound of someone running a formation. She was in running gear, and I was in running gear. We were both going the same direction. We ran. We ran for 40 minutes without talking, which sounds strange and wasn't. There's a kind of company that doesn't require language, where the presence is the thing, the shared pace, the sound of two sets of boots on pavement. I've had it with maybe 6 people in my career. It's the rarest form of communication. Around the 3-mile mark, she said, Pryor told me something before he PCS'd. I didn't say anything. He said, Vasquez, there are 2 kinds of women in this army. The ones who spend their whole career teaching men how to treat them, and the ones who demonstrate it once. The pavement, the dark, plus the distant formation. He said he'd, watch me teaching for 11 years, she said. He, in my opinion, said I might want to stop teaching and start demonstrating. We ran another quarter mile. Did he know? I asked. That it basically would go like it went. I don't think he knew it would be Reyes, she said. I think he honestly knew it would be someone. Reyes came off crutches in December. I know this because the casualty tracking system updates automatically, and I have a standing filter because that's the kind of administrative thoroughness that has defined my career in ways both useful and slightly pathological. He came off crutches in December and returned to limited duty in January, and I have no further information about him beyond what the system tells me, which is that he exists and that he's serving and that somewhere in his file there's a letter of reprimand that he may or may not think about. I think about the sound, not obsessively, not in the way that signals something clinical. Just sometimes in quiet moments, in the green notebook moments, I hear it again, that branch crack pop, and I think about what Vasquez said, 2 seconds to decide how far you take it. 2 seconds, which I have made decisions in my career in Mosul, in Kandahar, in rooms that smelled like gun oil and fear that people would look at from a distance and say, how did you make that call that fast? And the honest answer is that the call isn't made in the moment. It's made in the 1,000 moments before the moment, in the years of accumulation that bring you to the point of decision already knowing what you'll do, and the moment itself is just the last step of a very long walk. Vasquez's 2 seconds weren't 2 seconds, and they were 11 years. In January, she was selected for Warrant Officer Candidate School. She called to tell me, which I don't know why she called, I wasn't in her chain of command for anything operational. I was the officer who'd taken 7 pages of notes about her, submitted a green notebook as evidence, and run 40 minutes of dark pavement without talking to her. Maybe that was enough, and congratulations, I said. Thank you, look, sir. Pryor's going to be insufferable about this, I said. She laughed. I'd heard her laugh exactly twice, and both times it had caught me slightly off guard, the realness of it, the way it didn't match the bus stop patients at all, and then somehow made more sense than anything else about her. Yeah, she said. Actually, he already is. Silence. Vasquez, I said. Sir. Off the record. Always, sir. You know it mattered, I said. What happened on that parade ground? You know it did. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I know 500 people saw it, she said finally. I guess that's what matters. Not what I did. What they saw. I thought about that. What did they see? I asked. That it cost something, she said. That it cost something. The green notebook from that period is full, and way my notebooks don't usually get full. I use about 60% of the pages on average, and then the next thing starts and I reach for a fresh one. This one is all the way to the back cover. The last entry is from January, the day after the warrant officer call. Like it's one sentence. What they saw. That it cost something. Below it, because I think visually and because some things resist the precision of language, I drew a helix. A spring. The careful coiled kind. The kind that remembers how far it was compressed. I don't know what Reyes thinks about. I don't know, to be fair, if there's a version of that October morning. That he has turned into something useful. A lesson, a recalibration, a reason to update the assumptions his body carries. I hope so, which that's not cynicism. That's genuine. The best outcome, the one the Army theoretically exists to produce, is that the letter in his file and the rod in his leg and the sound, that sound, compose themselves into some form of revision. But I've actually been doing this long enough to know that revision isn't guaranteed. What is basically guaranteed is this. Somewhere in a class at Warrant Officer Candidate School, There's a woman with 11 years of modulation in her body and a combative certification that caused someone a spiral fracture to understand. She's teaching. The students don't know the full story yet, but the story has a way of arriving.